Now we'll see diarthrodial joints and types. Diarthrodial joints and types. Here, diarthrodial joints also called as synovial joints. Diarthrodial joints also called as synovial joints. In this diarthrodial joints, these are freely movable joints. These are freely movable joints. In these joints, there is a types of these diarthrodial joints. Traditionally, these joints are divided into three types: uniaxial joint, biaxial joint, and then triaxial joint. How they divided this into uniaxial, biaxial, and triaxial means on the basis of degree of freedom. What it means, what is the degree of freedom means, suppose if we say 1 degree of freedom means there only one axis will be present, on that joint, in that one axis visible movements will happen, so what is this one axis visible movement means, suppose if we take elbow joint movements, we have flexion and extension. Only two movements we are having. So these two movements will happen in which plane? Sagittal plane. These two movements will happen in sagittal plane. And which axis these movements will happen? This axis is frontal axis. So what it means, uniaxial means they will be having only one axis. Here, for example, if we take elbow joint is having only frontal axis. In this frontal axis, what are the movements we have? Flexion and extension. So that 1 degree of freedom. If one axis is there, visible movements will be only two. If one axis is there, visible movements will be only two movements. Here those two movements are flexion and extension. So that's the point. On that basis, see, uniaxial means one axis, 1 degree of freedom. will be there. So here two movements are possible. Here bi-axis, that means 2 degree of freedom. So 2 degree of freedom into two movements, total 4 movements will be there. This is triaxial. So here 3 degree of freedom. So that 3 degree into 2 movements equals to 6 movements. So in this triaxial joint, 6 movements will be there. Biaxial joint, 4 movements will be there. Uniaxial joints, 2 movements will be there. So on the basis of the main axis, they divided the joint into uni, bi, and triaxial joints. Now we'll see uniaxial joints. In these uniaxial joints, we are having two types of the examples. First one, hinge joint. Second one, pivot joint. First one, hinge joint and pivot joint. Here hinge joint is 1 degree of freedom. Pivot joint also 1 degree of freedom. Hinge joint example, elbow joint we can take as example. Here pivot joint, atlantoaxial joint is the example. Suppose now we are seeing hinge joint. So here if we take hinge joint, here we will be having lower end of the humerus. Here this is our radius. Here this is our ulna, radius and humerus. So between this elbow joint will be having flexion and extension. These movements will happen in sagittal plane and frontal axis. So only two movements will happen in uniaxial joints. Now pivot joint example, atlantoaxial joint. Here atlas is the first cervical vertebra. Second one, axis is the second cervical vertebra. So atlas vertebra is going to create a ring in that structure. It is created by the transverse ligament. Suppose this is atlas, then axis. This is the axis. Axis will be having one odontoid process. This process is nothing but this is axis. This process is nothing but odontoid process, also called as dens. So inside the ring, this dens is going to rotate. To create the rotatory movement of the neck. So that inside this, the rotation will happen in transverse plane and vertical axis. Here also only two movements are possible. So that hinge joint and pivot joints are the examples for the uniaxial joints. Biaxial joints. In this biaxial, see, in our human body we will be having two types. First one, condyloid variety, and second one will be having saddle variety. So these two are the examples for the biaxial joints. This condyloid joint Suppose if you take, this is the metacarpal, this is our proximal phalanx, this is proximal phalanx, this is middle phalanx, this is distal phalanx. Okay, the joint between metacarpal and proximal phalanx, metacarpophalangeal MCQ joint. This is the condyloid type of joint. Here we'll be having flexion extension movements, and if we see limb like this, like this, so here we'll be having flexion, extension, and abduction and adduction movements. Adduction movements of the fingers. So that here it is a 2 degree of freedom. That means 2 axes will be there. That is 4 movements. Flexion, extension, and abduction and adduction. So this is one example. MCP, metacarpophalangeal joint, is example for condyloid joint. Now we'll see saddle. In this saddle joint, here also 2 degree of freedom. Here also we'll be having both flexion, extension, and abduction and adduction movements. We'll be having here flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction. Example for this saddle joint. Suppose if we take, this is our radius. Here we'll be having trapezium carpal bone. Then here we can see the first metacarpal. This is nothing but thumb. Okay, first metacarpal. The articulation between first metacarpal and trapezium is the example for the saddle joint. From here we'll be having remaining four fingers. This is our ulna, this radius. So between trapezium and first metacarpal, saddle joint will be there. Here possible movements: flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction. So these are the two movements will happen in saddle joint. Okay. Triaxial joints. Triaxial means here the degree of freedom is 3. That means movements will happen in 3 planes and 3 axes. So total movements will be 6 movements will be there. So example for this joint: first one, plane joints. Second one, ball and socket. So these are the examples for the triaxial joint. Also called as the multi-axial joints. Okay. Now suppose if we take plane, what is this plane joint means? Plane joints where we can see. Suppose if we take our carpal bones, this is our radius. Here we will be having ulna, radius and ulna. It will articulate with radius, no? So here radius and ulna will be having here. So this is our first carpal bone, scaphoid will be there. This is our second carpal, lunate. Then this is our tricuteral. Here we will be having pisiform. Scaphoid, lunate, tricuteral, pisiform. Then here we will be having trapezium. Will be having, here we will be having trapezoid. This is our big capitate, and last one here we will be having hamate. So capitate, lunate, tricuteral, pisiform, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, hamate. So these are the proximal row of carpals. These are the distal row of carpals. So the joints between all these carpals, so here scaphoid, lunate, tricuteral, pisiform, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate. So the articulations between all these carpals are the examples for the plane synovial joints. So here atlas surface need not to be in one is concave, one is convex. Not like this. Here one atlas surface can have both concave, convex. One more can have both concave, convex. So these are the examples for the plane synovial joints. Now we'll see ball and socket. This we know very well. Ball and socket. Here 3 degree of freedom will be there. Examples for ball and socket, we have shoulder joint. Simply we can tell GH joint, glenohumeral joint, and hip joint. Here we know shoulder joint movements. Here will be having flexion, extension, abduction and adduction, and internal rotation and external rotation. Flexion, extension, sagittal plane, frontal axis. Here abduction, adduction, frontal plane and sagittal axis. Internal, external rotation, transverse plane and vertical axis. So these are the examples for the ball and socket joints. Diarthrosial joints. Here we will be having uniaxial, biaxial, triaxial. So examples for the uniaxial joints: here we will be having pivot joint, hinge joint. Here biaxial joint example: condyloid joint and saddle joint. Here if we see triaxial joint example, here we will be having plane joints, then ball and socket. So these are the types of the joints. So here if you see uniaxial, 2 example, biaxial 2 example, triaxial 2 example. This uniaxial, biaxial, triaxial, this is the classification according to the degree of freedom: 1 degree, 2 degree and 3 degree. What are these types means? These are the examples, these are the types based on the shapes and function, shapes and function. These are the examples. Suppose if we take pivot joint, what is the pivot joint example? Atlantoaxial joint. Hinge joint example, elbow joint is the hinge joint example. Here condylar joint example, MCP, metacarpophalangeal. Here saddle joint example, thumb. Simply we can tell thumb joint is the example. Here plain synovial joint example, joints between carpals. Ball and socket example, shoulder joint or hip joint. So these are the examples for these varieties. These are the examples for this classification. Okay, diarthroses joint. Okay, types of joints. So here joints also called as arthroses, types here will be having synarthroidal joints, then diarthroidal joints also called as synovial joints. In this synarthroid we will be having fibrous joint and cartilaginous joint, fibrous and cartilaginous joints. In this fibrous will be having sutures, gomphoses and syndesmoses. Cartilaginous will be having symphysis and synchondroses. Here diarthroidal will be having uniaxial, biaxial, triaxial. Again in uniaxial we have types pivot, hinge joint. Biaxial will be having condyloid and saddle joints. Triaxial examples here will be having plain joints and ball and socket. So these are the types of the joints. These are the types of the joints in the human body. Clear?